Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Narnia, Age of Conan. You pick your setting, but ask yourself this. What do Gondor, Narnia, Taldore, Westeros, Land of Oz, Wakanda, Camelot, and Great Britain all have in common? Well, if it isn't obvious, they are all ruled by a monarch, be it a king or a queen. Now, do you need to know what a kingdom is when world building? Honestly, I believe it helps tremendously if you do. So I invite you to stick around, have a cup of something tasty, and I will give you a very short version of what you need to know to take your world building to the next level. Hello all you wonderfully funky people, and welcome to today's episode on kingdoms and how to implement them in your world building. I have taken a bit of a break from scattered terrain and prop making to come back to my usual format, where I take you for a spin through history and help you build better, more detailed worlds for your fantasy setting. While we will be talking about what a kingdom is, I will also be painting an awesome miniature, and I will stop from time to time and talk about how the painting is progressing. Now, let me introduce you to the miniature of today's episode. Let me introduce you to Augie T. Fungus, my wife's second campaign character, a very wholesome halfling bardlock. For those not in the know, it is a multi-class of warlock and bard. As you can see, she is sporting a stylish coat, high riding boots, and wielding a sword and a mighty ukulele. She was created on Hero Forge and printed by an amazing friend, and I want to shout out to you, mon cher. Thank you. I will be spending a significant amount of time on the face, as I want to get as close as possible to my missus's request. And I will be using a cheat for the eyes, and I will be honest, I'm not ashamed in the least. Eyes are my weakness when it comes to miniature painting, so I will take any advantage I get. Because I don't want to keep you in suspense, I will be using very fine liner pens. I will be using a 0.4mm for the irises and a 0.05mm for the pupils. It will turn out great. I promise you, I strongly recommend. And as always, hope you enjoy the paint job and the world building. With that out of the way, let's get started. First, a few questions to help us set the scene. First, is it imperative for you to know everything about how a kingdom works in order to create a whole world? No. Did Tolkien describe in great detail how Theoden ran his kingdom? No. Did Tolkien know how a kingdom was ran? I'm sure he did, as he was a great scholar. Did he assume his readers would know how a kingdom was ran? I have no idea about that, but if I were to bet, I would say yes. Will it help you to know what a kingdom is in your world building endeavors? Hell yeah. Why? Because even if you don't go into great detail, it will help you with political intrigue, plot twists, stories of civil wars, schemes and plots, infiltrations and alliances. Who had a king or a queen's ear? Who had access to them, and who was a real threat to them? With that, let's dive in. Since the most ancient of times, lost in the shrouds of time, humans have organized in different ways. At first into small family units, then clans, then tribes, and later on into kingdoms and empires. Actually, kingdoms are one of the oldest state forms. Actually, the oldest recorded kingdoms were Kenjir or Sumer and Kemet or Egypt more than 5,000 years ago. where do the words king and queen come from? King comes from the Anglo-Saxon König, derived from the Germanic Kuningas, Dutch König, but this word was taken actually from Finnish and Estonian. That means it's a little bit more recent. While queen comes from the Old English quen, and many other derivatives of that word, but they all mean wife. In the Romance languages, namely Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French and Romanian, the word comes from the Latin rex, a term derived from Indo-European languages. What is a kingdom? According to Merriam-Webster dictionary, it is a politically organized community or major territorial unit having a monarchical form of government headed by a king or a queen. But let's be honest, this doesn't really answer much. So let's take it step by step and break it down into something we can actually use when world building. How did kingdoms come to be? In the earliest stages of human history, as you might imagine, the population was not as high as it is nowadays. There were fewer large cities and settlements, and each of them was in essence a state in its own rights. And it had its own ruler or rulers, own organization, beliefs and laws. The earliest kingdoms came to be when the ruler of a city began conquering and controlling other cities and settlements, allowing for more resources to be pooled and used towards a singular goal. The ruler would offer protection and a direction for their subjects, and in return the subjects would pay taxes, pay in goods and or in military service. What kind of power did the first kings and queens have? When thinking of kings and queens, most of us think of an individual with absolute power. Don't deny it, I see you, I know what you're thinking. In reality, that wasn't usually the case. Most kingdoms were not controlled or ruled by an absolute monarch, a king or a queen having absolute power and ruling everything themselves. No. In reality, the rulers did have power to create and enforce laws, but most kingdoms were broken up in smaller territories that were governed by local officials who indeed answered before the ruler. Such territories could range from a cluster of villages and production centers to several towns, perhaps a single larger city like in the case of ancient Sumer. But all of these territories had to pay taxes and pay in services. Besides naming people they could trust in positions of power throughout the kingdom to rule over these divisions, rulers would also sell, auction and just rent off territories in order to increase their revenues. But when it comes to power, they still had to uphold the law, and although kings and queens were sometimes above the law, even they had to answer to the people around them to a certain degree. How were kings and queens elected? Well, depending on the region and the moment in history, this can vary. Most times it was a hereditary thing, with the children or close family members to the ruler taking over upon their death. For most of history, it was actually the firstborn male child that would ascend to the throne, but this was not exclusive. There are multiple famous female rulers such as Cleopatra and Zenobia, Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth and many others. But often, when it came to female children, they would usually be married off to form alliances or to consolidate power. If the ruler died without leaving any descendants, the next of kin, usually male, such as a brother, a cousin, an uncle, a nephew, etc., would take over. If the ruler who deceased was the last of their line and no far-off relatives could be located, and there wasn't a clear succession set in place, a new ruler would ascend through, unfortunately, sometimes or most of the times, civil war. This is why rulers would ensure their line was secured by having several children. This, of course, came with its own risks, as the younger children could perhaps make a move against their older siblings and try and take the throne. again resulting in a civil war. There are also examples in history when the king or queen were elected either directly by the people, but this usually was done through violence, or by a governmental body such as a senate that was made up usually of noblemen who had the king or queen's ear. As I mentioned earlier, ruling alone was rarely the case, as they would need officials to run the day-to-day affairs of cities, counties, provinces, etc. Moreover, the rulers would heavily rely on advisors, people with much more experience in areas where the rulers would lack. Among these officials would be generals, admirals, heads of the clergy, heads of guilds, wealthy noblemen who supported them, family members, and, depending on the time period, even or especially the court jester would be an invaluable voice to be listened to. If that surprises you, check out my video on bards and jesters, as it explains why this was the case. With that said, let's talk about the miniature for a bit before coming back to our kingdoms. With her face and clothes done, I had to come back to darken her hair a little, as I went a little too bright for Augie, according to my wife. This is a very important piece of advice. If you do a commission for somebody, if you have a paying client or just a family member, check in with them from time to time, make sure you're on the right track and everything is to their liking. And even if you don't do it for somebody else and you do it for yourself, from time to time take a step back and revisit areas if need be. Let the miniature speak to you. To darken the hair a little, I went with Seraphim Sepia, the least used wash in my arsenal, by far. And once that is done, Agrax Earthshade for the win, for the rest of the miniature, my favorite wash. As you can see, it's turning out amazingly. Okay, let us continue. Ancient kingdoms versus medieval kingdoms. Is there a difference between ancient and medieval kingdoms? No, not fundamentally. They all kinda had the same structure and the rulers kinda had the same modus operandi. A ruler would ascend to power, would consolidate it, would wage war with neighbors, expand borders or be pushed back, and with time, the kingdom would either collapse and be replaced or engulfed, or grow into something more when not threatened by, let's say, neighboring empires. At least here in Europe, in antiquity, the Roman kingdom, then republic, kinda engulfed most rivaling kingdoms, evolving into an empire, and what was left were mostly tribal nations. Things did not change even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when the world stepped into the Middle Ages and its three stages: Early Middle Ages, High Middle Ages, and Late Middle Ages. In this time period, or in these time periods, we have several nations vying for power, going from kingdoms to empires, reaching a sort of balance. What did change was that at the end of the Late Middle Ages and start of the Renaissance, kingdoms changed to monarchies ruled by a monarch or a sovereign. What was the relationship between the ruler and their subjects? A noteworthy aspect when it comes to kingdoms is that there is a clear and straightforward relationship between the ruler and their subjects. It is quite complex, but I will break it down a lot so you get the gist of it. A ruler would require that all officials swear allegiance to them, pay taxes, and contribute a number of soldiers fully armed in case of war. In medieval times, the number of professional soldiers was not as high as you might imagine, at least in Europe, and wars were mostly fought by conscripts, so average Joes that were sent to war. Higher-ranking officials such as dukes, counts, barons, etc. also had retainers, usually knights who were professional soldiers, but I will make a video on them another time. You remember the drill? Another story for another time. These knights would perform military services in return for favors. So, in essence, the ruler would uphold the law, would give out favors, benefits, positions, would auction off some positions, would give parts of their lands, and in return, they would be paid taxes, paid in goods, lent money in case of wars, and would be supplied with soldiers to boost their ranks. Again, This is a very oversimplified explanation of the feudal system, but you get the picture. What is a monarch? Give me 1 second. There's somebody here who wants to say hello. So, nowadays we hear that kingdoms such as Great Britain are monarchies ruled by a monarch, but this wasn't always the case throughout history. Actually, for the longest of times, not all kings were monarchs, but after the 16th century, most monarchs were sovereigns. Okay, this is messing with my brain, so let me explain this. And although I will try to keep this really simple, please bear with me, because at the end of the day, this is still political theory. So, a monarch or a sovereign is a ruler with undivided sovereignty or supreme power, supreme authority. This is what literally a sovereign means, a supreme leader. The monarchs come to power hereditarily, most of the times from father to son, but not exclusively, although it depends on the time period. The closer we get to our time, the more often you see a queen on the throne. Sovereignty was a concept invented in the 16th century, so at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of Renaissance, by Jean Baudin in his role of avocat du roi, or king's advocate. Baudin was a French political philosopher who was crucial for introducing the idea of a king having ultimate power. This was as a response to multiple civil wars that tore France asunder, and this gave the ruler more power to deal with rebellious noblemen. This wasn't something new by any means, as kings and queens have always had a lot of power, but for most history, the kings and queens were, I wouldn't go as far as to say held to account by the court, but to a certain degree, they kinda were. The noble houses, the military leaders or religious leaders, had more sway, they had more power, more influence over the ruler, and if the ruler would remove any of them, the court would sometimes react, and not in the most positive way. Getting rid of important people was a little bit more tricky. But after Baudin introduced his idea of sovereignty, it spread like wildfire through the European courts and all rulers became monarchs. The idea of sovereignty leans heavily on the idea that the monarch had ultimate power. They weren't beholden to the government, they were the government. Their word was final by divine right and by the law of the land, and their subjects had no other choice than to obey their rules. The monarch had to govern using both the divine and natural laws, meaning that the 10 Christian commandments, at least here in Europe, were state laws, and they were used to complement the laws of the land or the natural laws. Again, the emphasis was on the fact that the subjects could not disobey the word of the sovereign. This was by no means new, as in ancient times almost all rulers invoked the divine right of rulership, but by the Middle Ages it was just a matter of fact that dynasties would rule over the people, by law, all law, any law. At the same time, although the 10 Commandments were part of the law, the states started moving away from theocracy, meaning the religious rule, and more towards the natural laws. Oh, and another intriguing change was one that came as a natural evolution that happened in the Middle Ages. In antiquity, kings and queens ruled over the land and territories, but by the Middle Ages, their focus turned to ruling over people. This was also at the base of the new system of sovereignty. Again, this is much more complex, but what I gave you is the very basic explanation of what a monarch was. Baudin also divided types of rulership into 3 types: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But we will talk about democracy and aristocracy on different videos. Kingdoms then and now. What happened in Europe was that stronger and stronger bonds formed between the royal families over time through either arranged marriages or treaties. Their attention started turning outwards towards distant lands. Trade became more intense and diverse. And of course, this brought along its own issues, such as colonialism and exploitation, but that's the topic for another time. Although I do have 2 videos on the spice trade that actually talk about this particular topic. If you want to find out more, they're over there. Slowly, over the next 300 to 400 years, absolute monarchies gave way to the popular sovereignty, and the best example of this popular sovereignty was the American Declaration of Independence in the 18th century. This form of organization also spread like wildfire, but it took a little bit longer. And the power transitioned from one single individual that inherited their power to a group of individuals that elected representatives that then invested one individual to rule. But that individual was an individual that they could remove in case of emergency. Nowadays, the role of a monarch has become mostly ceremonial, and monarchies have turned from their absolutist form to constitutional monarchies, such as in the case of the British monarchy, where the country is ruled by a constitution and a parliament. Other monarchies include Sweden, Belgium, Japan, Morocco, and these are places where this also applies. And there are also a few monarchs, princes and princesses out there wandering in exile. And as you might expect or know, there are still a few absolute monarchies around the world, such as Saudi Arabia, Eswatini and Brunei, where although the land is ruled by a set of laws, the monarchs remain the absolute authority above law. They are invested by divine powers and by the law of the land. And with that, let's go to the miniature and start wrapping things up. I'm now wrapping up the ukulele. It turned out amazing. I got my wife's approval. She's happy with the result. Everything is awesome. She did throw me for a loop. As you can see, she added a small bird on the base, and I kind of missed it at first, and then she reminded me that I have to paint it, so good thing she did. I might have missed it for a rock. The base is quite complex and quite interesting. I will be spending a significant amount of time on it as I want to get it right, and I saw that there are some runes that I will try to make them shine. I will try to make them shine, yeah. This was one of the best miniatures I painted when it comes to character minis. And knowing the backstory or part of it, it makes a lot of sense and it makes the painting job even the more enjoyable. A very light tan on the dirt, adding some more green to the vines. And as you can see, now I'm painting in the runes. As always, hope you enjoyed the paint job and the world building. And now you know what a kingdom is, in broad strokes at least. You can easily take everything you learned here today and implement them in your world. When it comes to political intrigue and plots and twists, it's hard to strike out with kingdoms and courts in the mix. Oh, and to really drive the idea home, I think I might do a video on one of the most famous of kings, King Arthur, but another time. Mango's fourth name is Lady. And with that, if you enjoyed this video and found value in it, please make sure you like, as it shows me it was useful to you. Make sure you subscribe and join this growing, wonderful, funky community. And make sure you hit that bell as to be notified when my next video is out. And if you really want to lend a helping hand, make sure you share this video with your friends, your GMs, your DMs, your storytellers, your candle keepers, your creators, players, neighbors, family, friends, pets, colleagues, everybody and anybody. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today, and I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey NP, the place where you get your dose of miniature painting, history, world building, diorama building, and trivia. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past, and never ever stop learning, world building, and creating amazing things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are awesome, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Until next time, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful, funky day. Cheers.